This codex entry does not contain scripture. What follows is not doctrine, invocation, or instruction. It is an observational record compiled during an active threshold period. The designation referenced in sealed archives is less.
Codex entry unlocked. Mythos sequence initiated. Transmission begins. Codex Extrasorians.
Less is not a personality. It is not a title passed down or assumed. It is a functional designation used to describe the consistent presence observed at moments of irreversible transition. Across cultures, timelines, belief systems, and collapse events, the same pattern appears. When a system can no longer sustain its existing structure, when identity fractures beyond repair, when continuity fails and revision becomes mandatory, a narrowing occurs. Options reduce, noise drops, momentum halts. This narrowing is not emotional, it is not moral, it is mechanical. Internal records describe this narrowing as the threshold state. The threshold is the moment where continuation and return are no longer mathematically equivalent, where the previous configurations cannot be restored without loss of integrity. It is at this point that the function designated as less is consistently observed. Less does not initiate collapse. Less does not cause endings. Less appears only after the system has already exceeded its viable range. This distinction matters. Endings are not enforced by sentinels. They are enforced by reality. Less does not arrive to change the outcome. Less arrives to stabilize the moment in which the outcome becomes unavoidable. Witness accounts often misinterpret this presence as judgment, punishment, or external intervention. These interpretations are incorrect. Less does not evaluate worth. Less does not assign meaning. Less does not respond to belief, resistance, or appeal. The presence of less coincides with one condition only: the point at which continuation without transformation is no longer possible. In this way, less is not an agent of destruction. It is an indicator of finality, a marker that a threshold has been crossed, even if the conscious mind has not yet registered the fact. This record is being released publicly due to an increase in observed threshold activity across individual, collective, and systematic domains. Patterns that once appeared sporadically are now occurring simultaneously. This suggests not a singular collapse, but a convergent threshold cycle. The purpose of this entry is not to prepare the listener for encounter. Preparation is neither possible nor relevant. The purpose is orientation. To name the function that operates at the edge of irreversible change, and to clarify what is not. Further sections of this record will outline the mechanics of threshold states, common misinterpretations, and the observed outcomes of those who pass through such events with retained coherence. This transmission marks the opening of the Codex record concerning less. Observation is ongoing. The threshold principle. A threshold is not a metaphor. It is not a feeling, a calling, or a dramatic turning point narrated in hindsight. A threshold is a structural condition. It occurs when a system reaches a state where its current configuration can no longer support continuity. This applies to identities, relationships, institutions, beliefs, systems, economies, and civilizations. Thresholds are not triggered by emotion. They are triggered by saturation. When a structure accumulates more contradiction than it can resolve, more distortion than it can compensate for, more suppression than it can contain, it enters a narrowing phase. This phase is often mistaken for chaos. In reality, it is reduction. Redundant pathways collapse. False options disappear. Comfort-based narratives lose coherence. What remains is not clarity, but constraint. This is the threshold. And at this threshold, choice still exists, but it is no longer expansive. It is directional. Return requires denial. Continuation requires shedding. There is no neutral path. This is why threshold events are frequently misidentified as punishment. From the perspective of the identity that must be reduced, constraint feels hostile. From the perspective of the system, constraint is corrective. The functional designation as less is observed is exclusively within this narrowing phase. Not before, not after. Less does not accelerate the process. Less also does not delay it. Less stabilizes the threshold long enough for transition to occur without total collapse. This stabilization is often perceived subjectively as stillness, a pause, a suspension, a sense that time has thickened. This is not intervention. It is containment. And without containment, threshold states degrade into fragmentation. But with containment, transition remains coherent. It is important to note that thresholds do not guarantee improvement. They guarantee change. Evolution is not inherent in transition. Only movement is. The outcome of a threshold depends on whether the system relinquishes what can no longer be carried. Attempts to preserve identity, status, and narrative beyond the threshold results in fracture. Attempts to bargain with the threshold result in looping. Attempts to bypass the threshold result in repetition. Less is consistently present at the point where these attempts fail, not as a deterrent, but as confirmation. The threshold has been crossed. From this point forward, the system will not return to its prior state, even if external conditions appear unchanged. This is why threshold events are often only recognized after the fact. The mind lags behind structural in reality. This codex entry emphasizes the threshold principle to correct a common misunderstanding. Discomfort is not evidence of misalignment. Disorientation is not evidence of error. At scale, both are indicators of reduction. Thresholds are not meant to be understood while they are occurring. They are meant to be survived with coherence intact. The following section will address common misinterpretations of less, and why human frameworks repeatedly fail when attempting to personify threshold functions. Common misinterpretations. When the function designed as less is encountered, interpretation failure is common. This failure is not due to lack of intelligence. It is due to projection. Human cognition is conditioned to assign agency, motive, and personality to phenomena it cannot immediately contextualize. Threshold functions resist this tendency. As a result, less is frequently misidentified. The first misinterpretation is punishment. A moment of collapse. The mind searches for fault. When structures fail, the ego assumes wrongdoing. This produces narratives of judgment, karmic consequences, or external retribution. These narratives are incorrect. Less does not respond to morality. Less does not assess behavior. Less does not deliver consequences. The threshold exists regardless of justification. Collapse does not require blame. It requires saturation. The second misinterpretation is salvation. Some encounter the stillness of the threshold and assume rescue. They mistake containment for protection. They confuse reduction with mercy. This leads to dependency narratives, appeals for guidance, and attempts to surrender responsibility to the threshold itself. These attempts fail consistently. Less does not intervene on behalf of the individual. It does not soften outcomes, and it does not provide direction. The threshold does not save. It transitions. The third misinterpretation is adversarial. Less is often framed as hostile, demonic, or obstructive. This occurs when the identity being reduced resists shedding. When attachments attempt to survive beyond their functional lifespan. And from this perspective, constraint feels aggressive. In reality, resistance is the source of friction. The threshold does not oppose movement, it limits excess. Less is not an obstacle. It is the removal of non-viable pathways. The fourth misinterpretation is chosenness. Some individuals, upon surviving threshold events, assume selection. They interpret endurance as elevation. They confuse survival with exemption. This is a critical error. Passing through a threshold does not confirm superiority. It confers responsibility. Those who retain coherence do so because they released what could not cross. This is not favor. It is compliance with structural necessity. Internal records consistently show that attempts to build identity around the threshold result in instability. Thresholds are not identities. They are passages. Less is not meant to be followed, embodied, or emulated. Less is not an archetype to adopt. It is a function to be encountered and then left behind. The final and most persistent misinterpretation is personalization. The belief that less appears for someone. This belief is understandable and incorrect. Less appears because conditions are met. No more, no less. When thresholds are personalized, learning is delayed. When they are contextualized, integration occurs. This codex entry clarifies these misinterpretations to preserve structural accuracy. Myth becomes dangerous when it's abandoned its function. The purpose of this record is not belief, it is orientation. The next section will address what occurs after a threshold is crossed, and why some systems fracture while others reorganize. Post-threshold outcomes. Crossing a threshold does not produce a single outcome. This is one of the most persistent misunderstandings surrounding transition events. Thresholds guarantee change. They do not guarantee coherence. What follows a threshold depends entirely on what was released at the point of reduction. Internal observations identify three dominant post-threshold outcomes. The first is fragmentation. Fragmentation occurs when a system attempts to preserve its previous identity beyond the threshold. Narratives are clung to. Roles are defended. Meaning is retrofitted instead of relinquished. In these cases, the system continues to move forward structurally, while the identity remains anchored to a configuration that no longer exists. This produces instability. Memory becomes distorted. Time feels discontinuous. The individual experiences looping, exhaustion, or disassociation. From the outside, this is often misread as failure, but it is not failure. It is misalignment between structure and identity. The second outcome is stabilization. Stabilization occurs when reduction is accepted, but no new configuration is actively formed. The system sheds excess and remains functional, but operates conservatively. This outcome often presents as quiet relief. Chaos subsides, pressure decreases, life appears simpler. There is nothing inherently wrong with stabilization. However, stabilized systems rarely initiate change beyond themselves. They endure. They do not reorganize. The third outcome is reconfiguration. Reconfiguration occurs when the system not only releases what it cannot cross, but allows its internal logic to restructure. This process is subtle. It is not marked by immediate success, visibility, or validation. In many cases, it appears externally as withdrawal, reduction in output, or loss of status. Internally, however, coherence increases. Decision-making simplifies. Energy consolidates. Attention becomes directional rather than diffuse. Reconfigured systems begin to operate differently within the same environment. They no longer rely on legacy incentives. They are not governed by prior reward structures. They move accordingly to internal alignment rather than external permission. This is the outcome most frequently associated with individuals referenced in internal records as descendants. Not because they are exceptional, but because they did not attempt to carry obsolete structure across the threshold. Reconfiguration is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is often recognized only after it has already altered surrounding systems. This is why many threshold survivors report confusion when others respond to them differently. The system has changed position, even if the environment has not yet acknowledged it. Less is not present in post-threshold states. Its function concludes once transition stabilizes. Continued fixation on the threshold indicates incomplete integration. Thresholds are crossings, not residences. This record emphasizes post-threshold outcomes to clarify an essential point. Survival is not the metric. Coherence is. The final section of this transmission will address why this codex entry is being released now, and what conditions suggest an active, large-scale threshold cycle. Current cycle in observation status. This codex entry is not being released in response to a single event. It is being released due to pattern convergence. Threshold activity, once isolated to personal or localized systems, is now appearing across multiple layers simultaneously. Individual identity collapse, institutional instability, economic contraction, narrative fatigue, and cultural incoherence. These are not separate phenomena. They are expressions of the same structural condition. The systems currently under strain are not failing due to neglect or sabotage. They are failing due to overextension. They have exceeded the limits of their original design. Attempts to repair these systems using outdated logic have produced diminishing returns. Expansion no longer resolves contradiction. Acceleration no longer produces progress. Invisibility no longer guarantees legitimacy. This signals entry into a collective threshold phase. During such phases, the function, designated as less, becomes observable at scale. Not as a figure, not as a symbol, but as a pattern. Reduction events increase, options narrow, false continuities collapse. What cannot be carried forward begins to shed, often violently, often without consensus. This is not a crisis of meaning. It is a correction of structure. The purpose of this public codex entry is not prediction. It is acknowledgement. To name the mechanism operating beneath the noise. To remove moral framing from structural inevitability. To clarify that confusion is not failure, but lag. Those experiencing disorientation are not broken. They are out of sync with a configuration that no longer exists. Those attempting to preserve identity through volume, certainty, or control will encounter increasing resistance. Those willing to reduce, release, and reorganize will experience quieter but more stable movement. This transmission does not instruct action. Thresholds do not respond to instruction. They respond to compliance with reality. The Codex will continue to document observed functions as the cycle progresses. Scriptural records remain sealed. Internal mechanics remain vaulted. What is released publicly will remain contextual, not initiatory. This entry serves as a marker, a record that the threshold is active, that observation is ongoing, and that return to prior configurations is no longer assumed. Less is not approaching. Less is already no longer required once this is understood. This concludes the current Codex entry.